Review copy provided by the author. Hey everyone, so I have a quick video review for you all today on The Shadow of Theron by Kathryn Troy. Now, I don't have a physical copy of this book, but I did read it on my Kindle, so I guess I could hold this up. Or wait. There we go. That's much better, right? Okay, I'm not going to hold this up the whole time. I'll probably just put a picture of the cover of the book right here. So, what did I think of the book? I thought it was pretty good. I liked it. Okay, well, that's it. Thanks for watching. No, not really. I'll get into more details on, aspects that I did like about this book, as well as some things that I didn't really like about it. But first, let me just do a quick summary of the book and what it's about, and then I'll get into my review of it. But don't worry, I'm not going to be discussing any spoilers. The Shadow of Theron, or maybe it's pronounced Theron or Theron, I'm not sure, I just pronounce it Theron. That might not be right, but I'm not entirely sure. But this book is about some holy relics in this world that have been disappearing. These holy relics were created by the goddess in a time long, long past in order for her to defeat an evil sorcerer, Argos. Lysandro, who's the main character of this book, knows that it's the village magistrate, Merrick is his name, who is the one that's been stealing these holy relics. Trying to find proof, Lysandro dons a mask at night and becomes the Shadow of Theron, hence the title of the book, in order to prove that Merrick is the one stealing these relics, and also to stop him. Theron being the legendary hero who originally destroyed Argos. The arrival of Sarah, which is a beautiful young woman that Lysandro falls in love with, creates more of a competition between Merrick and Lysandro, and of course escalates their rivalry. So that's an oversimplified summary of the book without getting into any of the details, because again, I want to avoid spoilers in this. And I must say, the story was fine, nothing too exciting, but it definitely was enough to keep me engaged throughout the entirety of the book. This is the first book in what is planned to be a duology. It's definitely a fantasy book, first and foremost, although romance in this book plays way more of a central role than in pretty much any other book I've, ever read. I don't really read romance books, and by that I mean I've never read a romance book, because I've always thought those books wouldn't be for me. I didn't think they would be books that would interest me. But after reading this book, which again is not strictly a romance book, but after reading it, it's definitely kind of interesting because I'm thinking, okay, hey, maybe now I do like romance books, because it was actually the romance aspect to this story that I found to be the most interesting. Now, if I went into this book having read a bunch of romance books in the past, I might have felt a little bit different about this, because some of the aspects to the romance are kind of cliche, and some of the aspects of it I actually didn't really like. But since this was honestly a new experience for me, it didn't bother me as much as it probably would have. But overall, I enjoyed it, and honestly, I'm kind of surprised how much I did enjoy that romance aspect. Reading through the story, you really want to see what happens between Lysandro and Sarah, and how their connection inevitably impacts the story and where the story goes. And I gotta say, that was probably my #1 favorite aspect to reading this book. One of the main issues I had with the romance aspect in this book is that it very much was a love at first sight. And when I say love, I mean love, like obsession love. Which, okay, maybe I can understand to an extent, because I imagine this is exactly what happened to my wife when she first saw me. No, not really. If she's watching this, I'm sure she's rolling her eyes right now. And even though I don't read romance stories, I do know that this is a trope and a cliche in a lot of romance books, so I know that could rub some readers the wrong way, but again, it didn't really affect me all that much because I don't read books like this. Just something worth mentioning, though. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about the characters and what I enjoyed about them and what I didn't really enjoy about them. Starting off with Lysandro, he is very much a female fantasy kind of character. He's gallant, he's a hero, he's handsome, he's strong, he's kind, he's super honorable. I mean, he's just, like the perfect man kind of thing. Which, I don't really think that's that issue, but it is something that you notice when you do read this book. He is like essentially perfect, or at least nearly perfect, because he's also insufferable. For example, Lysandro is very fast to jealousy and anger. And when I say anger, I mean like white-hot rage. When Sarah's practicing for this play, Lysandro notices that her breasts have been wrapped because she's playing a male character in the play, and the way Lysandro reacts to this is just, like, insane. So let me give you a quote from the book. When he discovered who had bound Sarah's sweet heavenly breasts, he would run them through, but not before gouging out their eyes. And, I mean, it seems maybe just a little bit intense. And maybe a little bit of a red flag? I don't know, that's kind of extreme. And that is one of the things about Lysandro that I didn't enjoy about his character. As I already mentioned in the quick summary, Lysandro is also the Shadow of Theron when he dons the mask. And the comparison between these two characters is really actually quite fascinating, or at least I found it to be quite fascinating. Because as the Shadow of Theron, he is this gallant hero who's out to protect the public. But then, when he's Lysandro, that is not something you would expect him to be in his, off time. It's really kind of interesting. Another thing that I didn't really like about Lysandro, and this is probably more to do with the Shadow of Theron character than Lysandro, even though it's the same character, but another thing that bothered me, and this might be a very, very minor spoiler, so just be forewarned, maybe skip the next 30 seconds, but Lysandro takes forever to tell Sarah that he is in fact the Shadow of Theron. And throughout a good chunk of this book, I just kept being like, ugh, geez, would you get to the point, just tell her. It gets a little annoying. And it inevitably leads to Sarah distrusting Lysandro. But again, I'm not going to get into any of the details because I want to avoid spoilers, but it just kind of seemed like a pointless issue that shouldn't have even been an issue just because Lysandro was being immature. But then again, I mean, he's a young adult. He's not supposed to be this, middle-aged guy, but he's not a child either, so I don't know. It's kind of an issue I had. Now, talking about Sarah, I gotta say I really respect the fact that she's a fully fledged character in this story. A lot of times in other books I read when there's a romance aspect, but again, I don't read romance books, but when there is a romance aspect, normally it's just this, super shallow character that is essentially placed in the story for the main character to fall in love with, but that person doesn't get any depth to their character, and it kind of comes off as the author was just trying to check a box as, okay, now I have romance in my book. In this story, you don't get that at all, because Sarah is a fully fledged character with her own issues, with her own personality, and with her own story that she has to follow. I really enjoyed that, and I really respect that. It also makes for a pretty interesting contrast between Sarah and Lysandro. So, cool. Merrick, being the main antagonist of the story, is of course a character that you do not want to like. And wow, in this book, do you, or at least did I, absolutely hate him. He's terrible. Not a terrible character, but just terrible in the things he does and the things he says. But again, I'm not going to get into any of those details. However, I will say, if you like to read about antagonists that you can kind of relate to, you won't really get that in this story. I don't think there's any way you could relate to Merrick. He is despicable. One thing I will say, though, is that I wish his motives were better explained in the story. His motives are there, but they really could have been fleshed out more, and if they were, it probably would have made him more of a relatable character than he was, but, I didn't really think it was that big of an issue. There are, of course, a bunch of secondary characters in this story that helps flesh out the world and the setting, but a lot of them aren't really that important to the story overall, so I'm not really going to discuss them here because there are quite a few of them, and I don't really think it's super important details. I will just say, though, that there are a bunch of secondary characters, and they really do help flesh out the story. However, there are a couple of priestesses in this book they're not main characters, but they're definitely more important than a bunch of the other secondary characters in the story. And this was another one of the issues I had with this book, because I honestly felt like these priestesses could have been fleshed out a lot more than they were. And hey, maybe they're going to be more fleshed out and more important in the sequel. I actually imagined they would be. But the fact that they were in this book just seemed like a missed opportunity to me. Honestly, it probably would have been better if we didn't learn about any of these priestesses, because it comes off as pointless, or at the very least, since they are in this story, I really wish their side of the story was fleshed out a lot more than it was in the book. So now that we've talked about the characters, let's talk about the world and the setting that the story takes place in. The setting and the world is definitely well realized, and it is pretty well fleshed out. Kathryn Troy, the author, definitely gives enough details for you to imagine the world in your mind, but she's also not exhaustive in her descriptions of what the setting looks like. And I know some people might not like that, but for me, since I read a lot of very heavy, very dense fantasy books, it is kind of nice for these setting descriptions and this world descriptions to be, decently detailed, but not overtly detailed where it gets, kind of exhausting. I feel like Kathryn Troy provides just the right amount of details for the reader to visualize the setting without it becoming just too much. And talking about writing style, I will say that this is a very, very fast-moving book. In 1 second, one of these characters is escaping from a confinement, and then the next second, they're all of a sudden attacking one of the other characters, and it's like, whoa, how did we get from here to there all of a sudden in like a single page? And I guess it's like, who cares? Let's just get to the action. And honestly, that can be a little jarring, although you do get used to it the more you read this book. And since, again, I do read a lot of fantasy books that are really slow, really detailed, take a very, very long time, it is kind of a nice change of pace to read a book that just, gets to the point super quickly. So I actually kind of like that. But again, some people might consider that a negative, but for me, it was a nice contrast with other books that I have read, especially recently. That being said, there are some aspects to this book that are pretty slow. For example, Lysandro and Sarah's relationship. It just takes a needlessly long time, and it's stretched out way too much, and it kind of gets a little bit annoying, but again, I'm not going to get into any spoilers. I will just say that since so much of this story is quick, I kind of wish the relationship was also not necessarily super quick, but quicker. Well, just a little thing that bothered me. Again, not a super big issue. The language and prose that Kathryn Troy uses in this book is very effective, I would say. She has this kind of unique way of setting scene descriptions that is both easy to understand, but also pretty engaging. As an example, let's check out this other quote from the book. Lothan felt his brothers gravitate toward him as he entered the cave, like pinpoints of darkness. They were moths, and he was the flame. The closer they got to him, the brighter he burned. The pitted ceiling poured moonlight on them, casting everything in a pale blue glow. Lothan took the customary place, only half listening as Goran worked them into a frenzy. So yeah, I gotta say, I really like the language and prose used within this book. And that brings us to the conclusion. So, as I said at the beginning of this video, I like this book. I thought it was pretty good. And I was honestly surprised how much I enjoyed reading the romance aspect to this book. Maybe I like romance books. I honestly don't know. I've never even considered reading a romance book before. But after reading this, maybe that's something I'll want to check in the future. I don't know. Or at least maybe I'll check out some books where romance plays a bigger aspect in the story, since I've always kind of shied away from those style of books. And although there were some aspects to this book that I didn't enjoy, none of those negative aspects were big enough to ruin my enjoyment of the story overall. Like I said also at the beginning of this video, this is not a standalone book. This is the first book in what is planned to be a duology. The sequel has not yet come out, though. That being said, though, I will say that the closure you do get in this book is fairly good. You really get to know what happens to all the characters, you get good closure for the majority of the characters, and the story kind of wraps up pretty nice and neatly, so you honestly can read this as a single book and not necessarily feel the need to read the sequel. That also being said, there are some aspects to this story that are foreshadowing things that are inevitably going to take place in the sequel, but you know, if you want to read this as a single book and not have to worry about reading the sequel, I think you still can, and you can definitely still enjoy this book. I gotta say, though, I do look forward to the sequel because I am fairly attached to these characters now, especially Lysandro and Sarah. I really want to see what happens to their relationship moving forward, and also to see what is going to happen that this book foreshadows at the end. And since I enjoyed this book, I imagine I would enjoy the sequel as well, so yeah, I am looking forward to that. Now, who would I recommend this book to? I would recommend this book to anyone that enjoys fantasy that has heavy romance elements to it. I think this book will be right up your alley. If you enjoy strictly just romance books, I'm not sure you'll enjoy this book as much as you would if you were also a fantasy fan as well, though. And if you straight up hate romance in your books, then I would probably avoid reading this because the romance does take up a good chunk of this story. If you are fine, or maybe like me, you're a little unsure if you like heavy romance aspects in your books, I would say, yeah, give this book a try. I honestly think you would enjoy it. I definitely did. And with that, we are now at the end of the video. Thank you everyone for watching. If you have any comments or questions for me, please let me know down below. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.